It's my pleasure and honor to introduce Cliff Willmeng. Cliff is a registered nurse, a husband, and a father of two from Lafayette, Colorado. He has participated in labor and anti-war activism and was one of the main organizers of Lafayette's successful effort to ban fracking and corporate personhood in 2013. Cliff is a board member of the Colorado Community Rights Network and organizer for the 2016 Community Rights Amendment. He is the Green Party candidate for the U.S. Congressional Representative in Colorado's District 2. I have known Cliff since 2013. I have found him to be consistently able to identify problems, going straight to the heart of the problem, and able to construct viable solutions. He has a gift with language that allows him to communicate with people in an inclusive, direct, and honest fashion. I've lived in Lafayette since 1986 and been active in several community efforts and worked with a lot of good people. But Cliff, I think, is in a class by himself from my experience. He's an effective leader who can see and work for the large view and the small view at the same time. With that, I bring you Cliff Willmeng.
Okay. So can everybody hear me all right? I just want to re-emphasize that today's event is being recorded for alternative radio. I have to apologize for the initial moments of this meeting. For the folks that weren't here, we did have an individual from the oil and gas industry enter the event with the intention of disrupting it. So if you think that these ideas that we're speaking about here today are not relevant or not a threat to corporate power, I think that we've proven conclusively otherwise. My name is Cliff Willmeng. Thank you very much for the introduction, John. John's pointed out that I'm a Lafayette citizen here in Lafayette, Colorado. I am a registered nurse that has worked both in critical care and in emergency medicine. I currently work in primary care, which is a bit more relaxing, to free myself up for other hobbies like taking on the oil and gas industry, for example. I'm going to direct us a little bit over to today's agenda. For one, we're going to do kind of an introduction here. We're going to talk a bit about what I'm calling the Lafayette Story. We've got a portion called How Corporate Power Came to Town and how we experienced that here in Lafayette. And then another section on writing our own Constitution, or the Colorado Community Rights Amendment that is now being circulated around the state. And then a final section called From Campaigns to a Movement, so that we can start to talk about where this kind of work heads and where we can start building this and what a movement would actually look like, or how we actually define that term. So with no further ado, I'm going to talk a little bit about how I came to be here today. For those of you that don't know me, my family and I moved out here from Chicago in, it was 2009. And we left Chicago because our daughter was 1 year old, and I had had some experience in Colorado before, and we always felt that the state was an incredibly healthy, vibrant, wonderful place to raise kids. And so we moved from we moved from Chicago to Colorado with that in mind. We moved out here to essentially become suburbanites. I mean, that's really the intent. And we succeeded in that to an extent, but there was a few catches along the way. when we first moved out to Lafayette, we kind of felt about it. And Lafayette, for those of you that don't know, Lafayette is a community that sits along Colorado's Front Range. The Front Range of Colorado is basically a ribbon of mountains that cuts the state almost in half. And so 95% of the population in Colorado sits on that Front Range. Lafayette is north of Denver and sits on that range as well. So we first moved out to Colorado in 2009, and we moved to Lafayette because Lafayette really kind of embodied a lot of the values that we had as a family. For one, it had a very good working class constituency. My kids go to this awesome bilingual public school. And in Lafayette, we celebrate both Martin Luther King Day, and we have a full day of celebration for the labor organizer, Cesar Chavez. So we just kind of felt like these were our people. Upon moving to Lafayette, we gave birth, my wife gave birth to our son, Charlie. So we had one child that was about 2 months old and another one that was about 2 years old when I first opened one of our local papers here and saw that the neighboring town of Erie had burst into some degree of protest. The story that I was reading centered around a picket of a few hundred people in Erie that were protesting a local oil and gas operation. This particular oil and gas operation was by Encana Energy, and the wells that they wanted to dig there were about 600 yards from their brand new public school, Red Hawk Elementary School. Being naive, I did not know that I lived on an oil shale at that time. This article informed me that I did, and Lafayette sits about 5 miles from my home. Now, I did have a lot of experience in Chicago doing a lot of variety of activism. As John pointed out, I was involved in anti-war efforts against U.S. military involvement in Central America. We fought the World Trade Organization in Seattle in 1999. Again, we were also part of organizing the big anti-war protests in Chicago on the eve of the Iraq War and continuing. Lots of labor organizing, for the last 15 years. To be quite frank, when I moved out to Colorado, we assumed that we were putting all of that stuff to rest, and boy, were we wrong. It did not take long for me to start into this article in this tiny little paper that showed this kind of sleepy suburban community now rising up against a big petroleum giant. To do the math, that the way the shale works out here in Colorado, Lafayette was essentially the next in line to be turned into an oil and gas field. At that point, I made some very quick calculations, and my understanding in 2012 was essentially that we not only had to mobilize the community to understand how dangerous this activity actually was, but that also that we had to be victorious over the largest, most powerful fossil fuel industries in the world. As you could imagine, that provoked a bit of a panic attack with myself. I also at one point turned to my wife and said, regardless of the outcome of this, we are about to meet 1,500 of the coolest people in Colorado, and that has played out truthfully since 2012. So, what are the first things you do when you realize your neighborhood is going to be turned into an oil and gas field? Outside of the panic, we already discussed that. First of all, you kind of scan the neighborhood to see if anybody understands the process that's just about to take place. And when we first did that, the first meeting that we had around fracking in Lafayette consisted of 4 people. There were 4 people at one of my friends' homes that sat down to start to develop a strategy on how we could successfully defeat the oil and gas industry and somehow preserve our town in the process. We were very, very young at that point and had a very hopeful picture about how the government or our local government or the environmental organizations would play into this and help us fix what we saw as a very dangerous potential problem. So, in the first days in Lafayette, what we essentially did was start to email our city council. This is a very natural process for folks. You go to the people that represent you, that live closest to you. And we ran into a bit of a wall at that point. We were told by the Lafayette City Council that not only, well, of course, that they were all concerned about oil and gas activity, but there was this one particular problem in that local governments were not allowed to stop it from happening. In other words, they said, our hands are tied. This is a state matter. The local government can weigh in, and we can go to hearings, and we can make our voices heard. But of course, nobody is obligated to act on what we hope for. The law is essentially written to remove us from the equation altogether. That provoked a second round of panic with myself because I thought for sure that the democracy that we had been promised in our 5th grade textbooks to some extent actually existed. And when it came to something as dangerous as drilling within the confines of a municipal area, I thought for sure that the government would act on the behalf of the people, that the environmental considerations would be weighed out, that the health considerations would be included in those decisions, and I was told quite pointedly that none of those things actually took place, that this entire problem sat with the authorities of the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission and our politicians, and of course, the industries that are aided by these laws. So what do we do at that point? You know, what we were informed was, what we were told was that even though we couldn't ban fracking per se, that we could ask for some better regulations about it. And we started to say, well, you know, what kind of regulations are we talking about here? And they said, well, you can't ban the activity at all, but you can negotiate various terms of including the activity in Lafayette. And so we started to research whether that solution that we were being presented was actually effective or satisfactory to us. And that's when I first started to kind of research the science of hydraulic fracturing. And when I first started looking into it, I looked at it as a health impact thing because obviously weighing out how this would affect my kids was something of a primary importance to me. So we started looking in 2012 about the general layout of the industry and how it was starting to evolve into our community. I should add right now where we're standing in Lafayette, Colorado. If we drive just 5 miles about northwest of here, we will hit Erie, Colorado. Erie, Colorado currently has 160 wells. If we continue, we'll eventually start to go into Weld County, and we'll hit Firestone and Frederick. Some of these communities have over 500 wells in their communities. Weld County, which sits northeast of Lafayette, is one of the most densely drilled areas in the United States. It has over 22,000 fracked oil and gas wells. It is an inherently agricultural area that has been given an F in air quality by the American Lung Association. So if you're getting an F in air quality and you're essentially just raising crops, the only real culprit to that could be oil and gas activity. And the oil and gas activity out here on the Front Range has actually become so widespread that Boulder County also was given an F, Larimer County was also given an F, Douglas County was also given an F, and Broomfield County was also given an F, all by the American Lung Association. So the mountains are very pretty here. The sunsets are spectacular and worthy of postcards. What you can't see, unfortunately, can kill you, and it's our air quality. Right about the fall about 2012, there was a doctor that started to research this because even coming from a medical background and working in the emergency room, you would have no way of testing people for health impacts of oil and gas activity. In other words, you may have symptoms of hydrocarbon poisoning, but we have no systematic way of identifying them, assessing them, or treating them. It's really not on our radar. There was a doctor named Dr. John Hughes that lives up in Carbondale, Colorado, that started to actually research this in earnest. And what John Hughes did is he said, well, you know, there is a test called a volatile organic compound panel that would essentially look at somebody's blood sample and determine if all sorts of awesome organic chemicals were dissolved in that blood that wouldn't normally be there. And so John went down to Erie, because Erie was a place where you could find lots of oil and gas activity, and he drew the blood of 12 different people in Erie. What he found was absolutely shocking to me. He found that of all the test subjects, every single one of them came back with a level of ethylbenzene in their blood at the 98th percentile. So we have to probably say at this point that you shouldn't have any ethylbenzene in your blood whatsoever. It is not naturally occurring. Ethylbenzene does occur when there is combustion of benzene, and if you go to any of the oil and gas facilities all the way across the Wattenberg Shale and out into Weld County, you will see stacks where there is an internal combustion taking place of commercially non-viable vapors and liquids. And these liquids and these vapors are ignited, and then they are just released into the atmosphere. You can't see it with the naked eye. If you have a very fancy infrared camera called a FLIR camera, you can look at all of these emissions. And these emissions are going on 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. So when we first got introduced to this kind of stuff and we were weighing out whether regulations could significantly protect us, these are the kinds of things that we were running into. And the conclusion to any sensible person, certainly any responsible adult or parent, would be that you can't regulate this stuff. What the regulations are essentially negotiating the terms of your own poisoning. And so, where we started to see that, the law was already starting to be written, or the law that we were being involved in was already written to force this activity on us, we started to look at fracking as a life and death question for ourselves in Lafayette. And really, it was that very sobering reality that led to our analysis and our strategy that would evolve from 2012 until the current day. I should say, we got all kinds of interesting little episodes with the oil and gas industry right along those days. At that point, Boulder County, which Lafayette sits in, was also being considered to be drilled. And there was a quote from one of the Encana representatives. Her name was Wendy Weidenbach. And she said that, here's her quote about drilling in Boulder County. She said, "Boulder County will be developed in the same safe and responsible manner that we have been doing for many years." That was in 2012. That was in July of 2012. A new news article appeared in August of 2012 in the Greeley Tribune, and this is how it read. An explosion at an Encana Corporation oil and gas, natural gas facility north of Fort Lupton killed a 60-year-old worker and injured 3 other men. Those two, that quote, and that event took place within 10 days of each other. So the reality that we were being handed and the line that we were being handed never coincided. In other words, we felt like we were being misled. That did not stop a lot of the local politicians from trying to convince us that this stuff could be well regulated. In fact, Congressman Jared Polis took it upon himself to make a public announcement thanking the Boulder County Commissioners from establishing a 500-foot setback from the well activity to the local residents, to the nearest home. Of course, when you ask Jared Polis, why 500 feet, why that magic number, where did you get 500 feet, there is no answer to that. It sounded like a respectable number, and so that was his authority on the question. He had done no research at that point, and none exists today that suggests any kind of setback can make this activity safe. But that's the kind of stuff we were being handed all the time. So we had a bit of a shift in our work because people were starting to pick up what was taking place. Of course, with the oil and gas industry out here in Lafayette, you can rely on any number of tragic industrial accidents that happen regularly, explosions, leaks, all fires, all of this kind of thing. And so people were starting to pick up attention on it. Right around that time, we were introduced to a group that works out of Pennsylvania, a law firm called the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund. And the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund represented a game change for us here in Lafayette. What the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund said was yes, what they are going to want you to do is write some regulations so that you can feel better about the activity that inherently threatens you. The work of the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund, however, is a frontal confrontation of that concept. And what they help people to do, they help communities to do, like Lafayette, is start to write laws that resemble what we want instead of what we are told that we have to accommodate. So that was a big change for us. Right around that time, we started meeting with one of their organizers. His name is Ben Price. He's a really nice guy. And we started to meet. And we met all the way through from December of 2012 all the way through March of 2012. And the conversation was essentially around how we could get around these big legal concepts. And at one point, Ben Price kind of cut the Gordian knot on the whole thing when we were talking about writing a law for Lafayette that would somewhat protect us from oil and gas. He said, well, what do you want the law to say? And of course, none of us ever get asked what we want the law to say. Of course, if we were Halliburton, we would be writing the laws every time we came to work. But nobody had ever asked us that. And so you had a community group now of about 20 folks that started to look at this from a very different perspective, that started to look as our local government as something that could actually protect us and be the extension of our own voice instead of the proxy for the state government and the oil and gas industry. So what we did is when we sat down and we started to get a sense of the law that we were starting to confront at this point. The Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund has a very catchy phrase for this. When communities walk into these kind of situations where you're either confronting the oil and gas industry, in Colorado it's very common, or someplace like in Pennsylvania that might be fighting a factory hog farm, or injection wells, or GMOs, or any other of these industrial nightmarish kind of scenarios. And what they say is that the laws have been written to keep your community very predictable. The laws that are written are essentially the bylaws of big major industrial activity, and so any kind of local democratic decision making interferes with the predictability of that industry, which of course eats into their profits. And so for the last 150 years, what we've essentially not been aware of is that the laws have all started to be written to create a determined outcome that absolutely orients all of our communities into accommodating whatever it is that these big industries desire. Now, when you first start to get involved in this, what the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund will say is that you will walk straight into a place that they like to call the box of allowable activism. And this is the activism that you are permitted to take a part of, and you're encouraged to take a part of it. In fact, you should probably feel empowered in doing so. But there's four major concepts that these laws kind of, that the laws essentially embody so that the corporations win at the end of the day, and of course your community loses. I'm going to go through them very fast right now. Like I said, I'm a registered nurse. I am not a lawyer. Even if I sound like one at sometimes. But the first one is Dillon's Rule, which was actually written by somebody who worked for the railroads and eventually became a very big judge in the United States. And Dillon's Rule essentially says that communities cannot enact laws that the state government hasn't allowed them power to enact. In other words, the local government is really just the child of the state. The state is the parent, and the local government can only do things that the parent allows them to do. Another one is the Corporate Commerce Clause. This was new to me, but embedded in the United States Constitution, corporations, well, it doesn't say corporations, but businesses have a right to do commerce. It is a constitutionally guaranteed right given to corporations. Beyond that, we have corporate personhood rights. And everybody seems to be very familiar with these days. Corporate personhood rights essentially say that corporations embody the same rights as natural persons, and removing them from their activity can violate their rights as people. And then, of course, out here in Colorado and in many other states, you have the state favorite of state and federal preemption. And what this basically says is that if a municipality were to enact a law that the state does not like or that the state has authority over, the state can nullify the law and make it go away, which they're quite good at and they're very familiar with. So this is essentially the conflict that we're walking into here. We have an inherently dangerous industry that is forcing itself upon a community. The community turns to its government in order to protect itself, and it learns that the government is actually there to force the activity into the community that doesn't want it to begin with. And so that's really the conflict. Now, the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund understands that the problem is systemic. And if the problem is systemic, and we'll get to this in a little bit, we essentially are saying that no matter what we do, the outcome will allow this stuff into Lafayette. And if the problem is systemic, and we no longer even have the right to protect our physical beings, if we are going to find a solution, we're going to have to break the law. And we'll get to that a little bit about movements, but I would suggest that movements begin the day that any group of people determine that the problem is already embodied such a high level of conflict and the outcome is so well determined that they decide that they're no longer going to play by the rules that weren't written by them to begin with. So that brings us to the Lafayette Community Bill of Rights. When Ben Price asked us what we wanted to write into our law, what they were suggesting was that we write our own Bill of Rights locally, and that we define what it is that we think that every man, woman, and child in Lafayette has a right to, and then if we want to, that we would ban the the industrial activity that would violate those rights to begin with. And so this is the Lafayette Community Bill of Rights. And what the Lafayette Community Bill of Rights we wrote ourselves, how it reads, it says this. It says the Community Bill of Rights and Obligations is law as follows. That it bans all oil and gas development, the disposal of associated industrial wastes, and the addition of new oil and gas infrastructure. So this would be pipelines, compressor stations, there's all manner of this activity. And then we gave ourselves rights. And what rights did we give ourselves then? This would have been about the spring of 2013. We said we had the right to community self-government, that the people would actually be sovereign within Lafayette, and that we had a right to clean air and clean water. We additionally said that we have the right to be free from chemical trespass or chemicals entering the space of Lafayette that could be inherently harmful to our people. That we had the right to peaceful enjoyment of home, the rights of ecosystems. I always say that this was very new to me, but what we did was we gave the natural environment of Lafayette its own independent legal standing and rights. That sometimes interferes with property rights, and that's another conflict. But we wanted the environment to be able to sustain itself in a legal manner and be defended by the people of Lafayette should it be intruded upon by any industry. And we also said that we had a right to a sustainable energy future. And so how do we do that? The second part of the Lafayette Community Bill of Rights goes after all of those big, heavy corporate privileges that we already discussed here today. So it says that we removed the corporate personhood in the Commerce Clause. This was within the law that we wanted to enact. And this is how it reads. It says, corporations in violation of the prohibition against gas and oil extraction or seeking to engage in gas and oil extraction shall not have the rights of persons afforded by the U.S. and Colorado Constitutions, nor shall those corporations be afforded the protections of the Corporate Commerce Clause within the United States Constitution or corresponding sections of the Colorado Constitution. So we set out to make corporate personhood illegal and ban fracking in the process. What took place at that point? Well, in Lafayette, like many areas of Colorado and many areas around the country, we have a legal designation called home rule, which means that we can enact our own laws through a ballot measure where people vote on them directly. So once we had the Lafayette Community Bill of Rights together, we submitted it to the city government, who was very apprehensive, to say the least, about it, and we began our campaign. No sooner had we qualified for the ballot that the entire measure got challenged by a citizen in Lafayette. We did not know who this person was, but what they were saying is that the Lafayette Community Bill of Rights did not meet the obligations, the legal qualifications to make ballot. So we were brought into a hearing at the City Council, and right there we were forced to employ our own attorneys and defend the Community Bill of Rights against what we eventually learned was an entire law firm that had been gifted to this individual by the Colorado Oil and Gas Association. We later found out that this individual had also been given a job at Halliburton 3 weeks prior to his challenge to the Lafayette Community Bill of Rights. Thankfully, the arguments levied against us by the oil and gas industry were ridiculous enough that even the Lafayette City Council determined them to be invalid, and we started into our campaign in full. So at this point, we were going to start, it was quite clear, the Lafayette Community Bill of Rights was going to be placed to a vote. In addition, fracking was going to be placed to a vote, and corporate personhood was also going to be placed to a vote. This was very threatening to our local government, and in October of 2013, they took on a full resolution broadly condemning the Lafayette Community Bill of Rights from nearly every angle that you could possibly imagine. So the City Council was broadly opposed to the measure. 3 weeks later, Lafayette voted, and over 60% of the Lafayette people voted in favor of creating the Lafayette Community Bill of Rights. It was a watershed moment, not just for Lafayette, but for other communities across the entire Front Range. Lafayette was the most audacious in the way we approached this issue, but there were big 5-year moratoriums that were built and voted upon in Boulder and Broomfield and Fort Collins. Prior to Lafayette, the city of Longmont had banned the entire technology of fracking. And so within the span of about 1 year, you had hundreds of thousands of people weighing in on oil and gas and all democratically voting in one way or another to keep it out of their community. We weren't content with just that because what we also identified was that, when we created the Lafayette Community Bill of Rights, we needed people in City Council to enforce it. And so we ran 2 people for Lafayette City Council in the process of campaigning for the Lafayette Bill of Rights. Both of those people got elected. The 2 strongest voices against our Community Bill of Rights were removed from office. And those 2 people enjoy Lafayette City Council today. One of them is my mom, Marilee Mazza. And so not only did we get the Bill of Rights passed, but we also started to alter the composition of our own local government. How many folks here know what took place next?
You got sued.
We got sued. Within 1 month, we received notice from the Colorado Oil and Gas Association, our friends, that said that our law violated state law. Our law was illegal, essentially. And that we had violated state preemption, and that they wanted the law to be repealed. They not only sued Lafayette, they sued Longmont, and they sued Fort Collins. So this was 3 Front Range communities. It was a real show because the governor, Governor John Hickenlooper, actually enjoined the suit against Longmont. So you had the Colorado governor, a Democrat, I should add, that basically was operating as a proxy to the oil and gas industry to overcome the will of his own citizens as a favor to the fossil fuel industry. So this has all been taking place. This entire conversation was built within about 1.5 years. That's how fast things started to move. So there we were sued. And of course, we anticipated that. We didn't anticipate that it was going to be so fast, but there it was. And so knowing that we were only one of several communities now that was facing litigation of the oil and gas industry, we started to look a little more closer into how these things actually operate. And so that we moved from a position of campaigning for our Community Bill of The premise, I'll say it again, what we had to deal with in Colorado is the whole legal concept is called state preemption. It's very familiar to everybody out here because we live it. If you would have asked me about state preemption, community rights, or fracking 3 years ago, I would have not known anything about what you were talking about. So really, it's the way it's kind of been experienced here is you kind of live in a democracy until you act upon that idea, at which point the entire concept is pulled away from you. So it was state preemption, and we started to look into this because we had been told, and we were starting to learn, that it was not just Lafayette, and it was not just Colorado, and the whole problem was not just fracking, but this was a broad-based disenfranchisement of communities taking place across the country. Very few people know these days, but way back in 2009, the Supreme Court of Colorado made a different decision. And what they had decided was that 5 Colorado counties that had banned the use of cyanide in gold mining were in violation of the same state preemption that Lafayette was being sued over. Why would these communities ban the use of cyanide? Of course, we can argue about the dangers of hydraulic fracturing all night. I want to think that we all understand that cyanide is poisonous. It's a pretty broad-based consensus, at least among the scientific community. But the way they use this cyanide in these mining operations is they essentially infuse it into water and they leach the gold out of the ore through a process called heap leach mining. And as you can imagine, if you infuse a bunch of cyanide into a water and then shoot it through mine tailings, you end up with this toxic industrial waste that has to be contained in gigantic ponds. Well, back in the 90s, the Summitville mine had these ponds, and these ponds failed. And the toxic liquid waste went into the Alamosa River and poisoned 17 miles of the Alamosa River, killed it. Right now, what is now being called the Summitville mine disaster is now a Superfund site that has run U.S. taxpayers over $200 million worth of cleanup costs. The company was a Canadian company, and of course, as you can imagine, as soon as things got too hectic with this disaster, they declared bankruptcy and all of their executive officers went up to Canada. So in response to that, 5 Colorado counties banned the use of cyanide. And within several years, the Colorado Supreme Court heard that case because they were sued no different than Lafayette. And the Colorado Supreme Court said that banning cyanide violated the corporation's rights because their right to access their mineral was the superior law. So if you start to look at this stuff, and a lot of people encourage us to go to our elected officials and make very sophisticated, convincing arguments about the health impacts and the real scientific damage that this kind of stuff can create. But the fact of the matter is our elected officials are not looking at this as physicians. They're looking at it as jurisdictions and as lawyers. They're looking to enforce the law. They're not looking to enforce our public health. And so that's a bit of disillusionment that we took place. So that took place in Colorado in 2009, but there's a lot more actually. The city of Denton, Texas, not too long ago, was the first city in Texas to ban fracking as well. And Denton sits right on the Eagle Ford Shale. Denton actually set the record. I believe that Denton was sued by the Texas Railway Commission, which is the overseeing body of oil and gas activity, within 72 hours. So as you can see, every time the communities step forward to exercise some degree of rights and protections, the corporations and industry utilize the powers that they have written for themselves to overturn those local efforts. It goes beyond that too. And it goes beyond environmentalism. If you look in Missouri, you will find that there was legislation to overturn or prohibit or preempt any local community trying to create a minimum wage higher than the state's. This is already successful that we've learned in Colorado. Right now in Colorado, our local communities cannot enact a local living wage higher than $8.23 an hour because living wages or minimum wages higher than the state's are also preempted by the state government. And it's not just Colorado, it goes to Missouri, it goes to Alabama, and I believe that Idaho just did the same thing this year. Now, there is a group which has earned a bit of a reputation for itself, called the American Legislative Exchange Council. How many folks here are familiar with ALEC? Yeah? Okay. We're getting more familiar with them all the time. And when I went onto their website and did a search for the term preemption, which now we're all kind of married to in Lafayette, I found 4 laws that came back on their site. And essentially what ALEC does is that they are a group of corporate attorneys that craft legislation really for the 1%. And these laws are doled out to different state legislatures like a deck of cards. And then you can essentially remove the powers of your local communities depending on what your needs are. So there's a few of them here. For one, we have the State Pesticide Preemption Act, which of course deals with communities trying to get rid of toxic substances like Roundup. This would prohibit local communities from banning various pesticides. There's another one that we just discussed called the Living Wage Mandate Preemption Act, which of course goes after communities trying to create living wages for their poorest workers. Here in Colorado, we enjoy this. It's called the Rent Control Preemption Act. And in Colorado and in other states, creating local rent controls in areas where the rents are skyrocketing and forcing people out of housing is preempted by state law. So Lafayette cannot create a rent control to protect housing for people because that's additionally prohibited by the Colorado state government. And then of course, you have the Labor Peace Agreement Preemption Act, which sounds very altruistic, but essentially what this does is it preempts municipalities from giving some boost or some advantage to unions or workers to organize on the job for better working conditions, wages, and this sort of thing. So local governments creating laws that would favor working conditions or unionization are also preempted under this act. So this is the kind of stuff that we ran into. And you know, when we originally got involved in this stuff, it was all around environmental questions. And you know, we didn't really have a wider lens to look at, for one, you know, communities outside of Lafayette or the immediate Colorado area, but even issues that would affect people in a multiple different ways: wage, housing, that sort of thing. I mean, how many people here have heard of House Bill 2 in North Carolina? So House Bill 2 that just got enacted in North Carolina is a preemption against the town of Charlotte, who attempted to give the LGBT community and transgendered people equal rights to bathrooms. And Charlotte created a law that would enact that civil right. And within a few weeks, the North Carolina legislature crafted House Bill 2, which is essentially the same thing. So now we're talking about preemption of environmental protections, workers' protections, and our basic civil rights that are taking place. These folks know the score. They know what time, what part of the game we're in, and they're moving to enact laws to create protections to their interests, and unfortunately at our expense. So at that point in Lafayette, I want to say kind of how we shifted, because we were thrown into a bit of a crisis due to how fast those lawsuits came, and we set upon ourselves to do something about it. And so over the course of the next couple months, we started to have meetings around creating a state ballot initiative that would address directly and amend the Colorado Constitution so that communities could start to liberate themselves from these oppressive corporate laws. And after a whole lot of discussion and dotting the I's and crossing the T's and figuring out where the commas went, we crafted a first of its kind constitutional amendment, and we're calling this the Colorado Community Rights Amendment. And I'm going to read it right now because it's very simple, but its powers are quite profound. There's 3 parts to it. The first one says that as all political power is vested in and derived from the people, and as all government of right originates from the people have an inherent and inalienable right of local community self-government in each county, city, town, and other municipality. It essentially says power to the people. That's really the shorthand version of it. Section 2 is based on the ideas of Section 1, and it gives us the powers that we need. It says, that right shall include the power of the people to enact local laws that protect health, safety, and welfare by recognizing or establishing rights of natural persons, their local communities, and nature, and by securing those rights using prohibitions and other means deemed necessary by the community, including measures to establish, define, alter, or eliminate competing rights, powers, privileges, immunities, or duties of corporations and other business entities operating or seeking to operate in the community. In other words, the community would start to govern the corporations instead of being governed by them. This kind of goes on because basically what it has to do is it has to remove ourselves from the current constraints. So it says in Section 3, it says, notwithstanding a few sections of local Colorado law, it says that local laws adopted pursuant to subsection 2, sorry about the legalese, of this section shall not be subject to preemption by international, federal, or state laws. How many people here know what the Trans-Pacific Partnership is? So, when we start to talk about state preemption and advancing corporate rights and authority, what the corporations understand is that they have to perpetually raise the power and decision-making away from the communities and keep it at a further reach from the communities. The Trans-Pacific Partnership does that up to the international level. So it takes the state and federal preemption and it hands it off to corporate tribunals that don't even respect national boundaries. So we wanted to address those kind of global trade agreements. The NAFTA agreement is like that too, the North Atlantic Free Trade Agreement. And then of course, because we don't want to give any community the right to actually curtail or remove rights that we've already fought and won, we place some limitations on the use of this amendment. And so it says that such local laws do not restrict the fundamental rights of nature, persons, or local communities, or nature secured by local, state, or federal constitutions or by international law, and also that such local laws do not weaken protections for natural persons, their local communities, or nature provided by state, federal, or international law. So in other words, the amendment works as a sort of one-way valve. You can build rights onto it. You can expand rights of people and the environment onto it. The current rights and the current regulations that people in the environment enjoy are not able to be removed through the powers of the amendment because we don't want them to be. We fought very hard for those things. So that's it. When we first started talking about this stuff in Lafayette and we started talking about the Lafayette Community Bill of Rights, we were met by a chorus of voices. And I understand what those voices are saying now, but back then it essentially said that these kind of ideas, going after the corporate power itself, going after the system that embodies that corporate power, are simply too radical for people. That they are an overshot of what we should be looking at as environmentalists and as community members. And that if we continued along that path, we would essentially be marginalized by all the major environmental groups, by the politicians, and everybody that also was playing part in fighting the oil and gas industry. And to some extent, that's actually proven true. Because every time we start to talk about the system that is advancing these things onto us, really we are defying what is, in essence, a kind of loser mentality, where you say that, well, you know, you can't get rid of the system. And because you can't get rid of the system, we all have to negotiate better terms underneath it. And in Lafayette, those better terms mean parts per billion of benzene that our kids are breathing. And when you start to say, hey, look, the system isn't broken. This is not an aberration to the way it works. The system is fixed. It's working perfectly according to design. And our job is to break it. And I think that that's essentially what defines a movement. To make a very long story short, we submitted the original version of the Community Bill of Rights in 2014. We were challenged by the Colorado Mining Association at that time, saying the same types of arguments that we found with the Lafayette Community Bill of Rights. What they said was that the Colorado Community Rights Amendment did not meet the qualifications of a state ballot measure, and that it needed to be prohibited from getting onto the ballot. That went all the way to the Colorado Supreme Court, and we won that decision. Unfortunately, in 2014, they were able to delay our campaign for so long that we weren't able to acquire the nearly 100,000 signatures necessary to get that onto the ballot. In the process of all of this, the lawsuits against Longmont and Fort Collins continued. So in the years of 2015, the lower courts determined that not only was the Lafayette Community Bill of Rights illegal, they found that in a decision of August in 2014, but they also said that even the moratoria that postponed oil and gas activity was illegal for the exact same reason. So I know that there was some strategic thinking saying, well, if you don't shoot after the system and you kind of, work into a more reasonable or pragmatic approach, you don't just ban fracking, but that you actually, try to delay it, that you could potentially avoid some lawsuits. Well, the lawsuit that was filed against Lafayette and the lawsuit that was filed against Fort Collins were almost identical except for the name of the town. And so the tension between this issue and the communities continued to ramp up. Standing here in Lafayette today in 2016, I can say this. We have resubmitted the Colorado Community Rights Amendment to the state. This time we were challenged by two individuals representing elements of the Colorado petroleum industry. Those individuals again challenged us all the way up to the Colorado Supreme Court. And in March of this year, we defeated those interests as well, and were allowed to start campaigning to put the Colorado Community Rights Amendment onto the ballot. That's where we are today. We are gathering signatures for the amendment. We have over 200 volunteers now working in 30 different cities across Colorado to get this measure. I mean, we're essentially, as we've said the whole time, that we're essentially putting democratic rights to a vote. We are not alone now. In Oregon, they have also adopted this language, and they are attempting to embed an Oregon Community Rights Amendment into their state constitution. Oregon just recently, community in Oregon just recently was found to be in violation of similar preemptions when they tried to ban GMOs out there. In addition, New Hampshire has now taken this wording into their state. And there's different industrial projects that they are facing in New Hampshire. The only difference in New Hampshire is that because it does not have direct ballot access like Colorado, the folks in New Hampshire have to they have to appeal to the legislature to put this onto the ballot. As you can imagine, what they are finding is that the politicians on both sides of the aisle are not interested in amending the Constitution to give people fundamental rights. That might take a little while to sink in, but I've usually called it the New Hampshire Dilemma. And really what that represents is it means that we have to start removing ourselves or advancing beyond the purely legal means given to us to put these amendments to a vote. In New Hampshire, it's very different than Colorado. Colorado, we can amend our Constitution directly, and I should add that no sooner was the ink dry on the Colorado Community Rights Amendment that new ballot initiatives came out just this year with the express purpose to make it harder to amend the Colorado Constitution. So if you forgive a football analogy, it's like they have to continue to remove the field goal posts. Every time we step forward to exercise some basic decision making, the access to that decision making has to be kept in perpetual motion. And so in New Hampshire, what we're starting to talk about is we say, well, if we do not have access to get these laws that are so important to defending ourselves and our environment and our civil rights to a vote, we are going to have to start to force the government to do something that it is not ready to currently do. And that essentially is what we are going to talk about now, and we're going to conclude with this, is what is a movement? Because all you have to do is go onto social media these days, and any online petition will usually include the word movement in it. Everything is a movement. If you vote for a politician, you're in the election movement. If you sign the petition to get better methane regulations, you're now in the environmental movement. And what we are saying here in Colorado is that that is actually not a movement whatsoever. It's more of a lobbying effort or a campaign. But as we said earlier, A movement takes place when a group of people determine that the system is rigged and set out to intentionally violate the rules that the system is pushing onto them. The abolition movement did not expect to regulate slavery or make it more humane. It sought to eliminate slavery. It broke laws to do that. It broke constitutional amendments in order to do that. The women's suffrage movement did not set out to lobby the government to do the right thing. They went into the voting booths and voted and were arrested and put in jail before the contradictions of the system became so unbearable that women were eventually given the right to vote. The labor movement. All unions used to be illegal in this country. The labor movement did not set out to regulate the terms of our own exploitation. The labor movement set out to create organizations to start to remove that exploitation. And when unions were illegalized, the unions were formed anyway. And when they said, well, you're not going to be allowed to strike, what the workers did was they started to take over the factories. And of course the governor said, well, we're going to call out the militia on you. And the workers said, well, if we need to die for these rights, we're going to do that. And in those moments, the big unions were all born by directly violating the rights and the expectations of those big industries. The civil rights movement is no different. Rosa Parks did not set out to get better seats for people of color in the bus. She went out and set out to violate the law so that the contradictions of segregation itself were pulled out into the light of day, and so the system could then be exposed and addressed in a direct manner. We call ourselves the Community Rights Movement, and we believe that we are a national body that understands that the system itself has to go. When fracking and democracy cannot coexist, one of them will always have to be removed. And we know that the Colorado Oil and Gas Association wants that to be our right to decision making. And what we are saying is, well, if you stand between us and our fundamental rights, it's you that they're going to be writing about in past tense, not us. We look at this as a national movement. And so we want to expand outside of Colorado, and we have started to do that now. We now have a national community rights network that has representatives, grassroots activists from 7 different states. And I do want to explain what I mean by that. You'll also hear the term grassroots very regularly as well, and let's define that term. Let's just say for the purposes of this discussion that grassroots means that you don't do this professionally. You don't get paid to do this work. You're doing it because you have to. You've been forced to, because you need to, because you're there to protect your own family. And the National Community Rights Network embodies 7 different states. New Hampshire, of course, is one of them. Oregon is another one. We have several other chapters in Ohio and Washington and Pennsylvania as well. And this movement is going to start to reach upwards into federal constitutional change. What we are starting to ask ourselves now is, given the conversation of global climate change, given the rapidly worsening economic conditions of our country, given the amount of police violence used against people of color in this community, is the Constitution as it's written even survivable? In other words, can we as a species exist under a state of law that removes us from decision making so that the fossil fuel industry not only enjoys itself in pursuing profits, but that is given a full mandate to override the communities? I would suggest as a conclusion that we cannot allow our efforts to be constrained by the pragmatism of a suicidal system and those are attempting to strike a bargain within that suicidal system. We have to start looking beyond what we're being offered in terms of activism, and we have to start going after the heart of the matter, which is systemic change, not climate change. And so, of course, I would invite everyone to start to look and research about what kind of work we are doing out here in Colorado. We aim to propagate this work. And in terms of history books and movements, we aim to put the Colorado Community Rights Movement and the National Community Rights Movement right up there with all of the other efforts that were called crazy and impractical and without adult behavior. And we aim to make history with this effort. So thank you very much.